So I've seen thousands of heart attacks over the last 10 years, literally thousands. It's one of the most common things we see in the A&E. But the thing about heart disease is that it doesn't always look or present the way that most people would assume. And I say this because most of the people I diagnose with some form of heart disease weren't expecting it. Most patients don't get the crushing chest pain or the dramatic collapse, just a normal Tuesday morning where the stairs feel a bit harder than they did 6 months ago, or a bit of an odd sensation in the chest or the neck. That's it. That is often how heart disease generally starts. And most people put this down to something else without a second thought. So what I want to talk about today is that gap. The years between when cardiovascular disease begins and when it announces itself loudly enough that somebody calls an ambulance. And that gap is enormous. And what fills it isn't silence. It is signals, really important signals that are quiet, easy to rationalize, and almost universally ignored until it's too late. And I've watched this play out more times than I can count. And if you want more of a reason to actually believe what I'm saying, then trust me when I say that we actually have a lot of healthcare professionals who come to the A&E and don't recognise their own heart symptoms. And indeed, my own dad, many, many years ago, when he was about 40 years old, actually had a heart attack and didn't recognise it at the time. And he's a paramedic. So, even the most clued up people don't always recognise these symptoms. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is really, really important to understand as you get older. But a lot of people picture heart disease as like a blocked pipe where rubbish builds up and the fluid can't get through and the pump sort of breaks. And that's not entirely wrong, but it misses the starting point by almost a decade, sometimes more than that. The real story begins at the inner lining of your blood vessels. So think of your arteries almost like a garden hose pipe. The water that flows through that is your blood, but the coating on the inside of that hose is an incredibly thin, living layer of cells called the endothelium. And this layer does something remarkable. It constantly produces a molecule called nitric oxide, which acts as almost like a built-in relaxant for your blood vessels. It keeps them soft and flexible and, importantly, open. It damps down inflammation. It tells the vessel wall to stay calm. Now imagine that you're running that hose with really hot, sugary, slightly corrosive water for years and years. Well, that lining will get rougher, it will degrade, it will produce less nitric oxide. So the hose pipe will stiffen, and once that lining is damaged, the body's immune system starts responding to the injury. It starts sending cells to the vessel wall that eventually contribute to the fatty plaques that we associate with heart disease. And here's the thing that should make you pay attention to this. This process, the early sort of degrading of that vessel lining, can be detectable on imaging a full decade or more before anything clinically happens. So that's 10 years at least of silent change before a heart attack. And during all of that time, you feel completely fine. Now, when the blood vessels that the heart is actually pumping against start to stiffen, the heart doesn't give up, it adapts. It works harder. The muscle starts to thicken in the same way that your bicep will grow when you lift heavy things repeatedly. Now, initially, that keeps everything ticking over nicely, but a thicker heart is less efficient. It needs more oxygen per beat. And crucially, it starts to struggle with the relaxation phase, the moment between beats when the heart fills back up with blood. So try to think of this like a sponge. So a healthy heart muscle squeezes and then springs back open easily, drawing blood into the heart. But a thickened, stiff heart muscle squeezes okay, but it doesn't spring back as well. So filling that heart becomes a bit sluggish. And when you exert yourself and your body suddenly demands more blood flow, the heart simply can't keep up. And this is one of the most underdiagnosed early stages of cardiovascular disease. And this doesn't show up on a routine ECG. It won't be caught in a standard GP check, but it shows itself in daily life, in the moments where effort suddenly feels a bit harder than it used to. And there's a second thing happening simultaneously as well. So the arteries that feed the heart muscle itself, the coronary arteries, they supply blood during the relaxation phase between those beats. So if those arteries have early narrowing from plaque, and the heart is also beating harder and faster because it's working against stiffer vessels, then the maths, sort of starts going wrong. The heart is demanding more oxygen, but getting slightly less. And that doesn't cause a heart attack, not yet, but it creates a kind of chronic, quiet oxygen debt that the heart silently adapts to. And that adaptation has big consequences down the line. Now, the early symptoms of cardiovascular disease are, well, pretty boring, to be honest. They are the symptoms of a busy week, or being a bit out of shape, or getting older. And that is exactly what makes them dangerous. So take tiredness, for example, and I'm not talking about the exhaustion after a long run. I mean the unusual fatigue after climbing just one flight of stairs, after walking from the car to the supermarket entrance, or carrying their shopping bags from the car into the house. And people will notice this somewhere quietly. They know it is different from how they used to feel. But quite often they don't say anything, because what are they going to say? Oh, I just got a bit tired walking upstairs. To a lot of people, it will sound ridiculous, but not to us, not to doctors who are actually listening to you. So, it goes unreported and we don't hear about these symptoms. And then we've got breathlessness as well. And the key word here is new breathlessness, not breathlessness that you've had your whole life from being sedentary, but a change, something that used to be easy becoming effortful. And sometimes this is one of the ones that I find most striking. People start sleeping with an extra pillow without really consciously deciding to. They just sort of find themselves more comfortable, slightly upright. Now, medically, that has got a name. It's called orthopnea. And it happens because when you lie flat, fluid that has been pooling in your legs during the day redistributes towards your chest and puts pressure on the lungs. In an emergency department, that is a big red flag for heart failure. And that is something a little bit different to the heart disease we've just talked about, but let's just include it anyway. In somebody's house, it's just a new pillow preference. It's just an extra pillow. But to us, that means something. And then we've got a gradually rising resting heart rate as well. Most people have no idea what theirs is and have never really tracked it. But a slow upward creep from a stable baseline in the 60s to a persistent reading in the mid to high 70s or 80s can reflect the heart working a bit harder just to maintain normal output. And research, interestingly, has consistently linked elevated resting heart rate to a higher risk of cardiac event like a heart attack or cardiac arrest, independent of other risk factors. And this is something you can track really easily just by getting a cheap fitness watch. You don't need an expensive Garmin, just anything for 20 or 30 quid that measures your resting heart rate. Another symptom of heart disease is ankle swelling in the evening as well. Nothing dramatic or painful, just a slight sort of puffiness by late afternoon, which happens because the body is retaining fluid as the heart isn't circulating blood quite efficiently enough. And it gets attributed to a long day on your feet or hot weather or a new medication. And then finally, waking in the night feeling a bit uncomfortable or short of breath. So this isn't from, a nightmare or needing to use the toilet, just an unsettled quality to your sleep that wasn't there before. Now, none of these symptoms alone is a diagnosis, but when several of these symptoms are presenting together, especially in somebody over the age of 50 with high blood pressure or carrying excess weight around the middle or not sleeping well, that cluster of symptoms is telling a very important story, and we need to be thinking about heart disease here. The thing is, one of the most important conversations I have is with patients who are surprised, like I mentioned earlier. So these are people who have a normal weight. They don't have a diagnosis really. Their bloods came back fine at their last check. They consider themselves to be healthy. And yet, insulin resistance, which is the metabolic dysfunction that can precede type 2 diabetes by years or decades, can exist long before your blood sugar comes back abnormal enough to flag on a standard test. And insulin resistance, it drives a hormonal environment that is genuinely toxic for your blood vessels. Elevated circulating insulin acts directly on your vessel walls. It promotes inflammation and accelerates the kind of changes that we've been talking about in this video. This is happening in people who have no idea. It is an epidemic at the moment. It is people whose GP has told them that their blood tests are normal. Now, if you pair that with really bad sleep, and the research on this is really quite interesting, then you're compounding the problem significantly. So during deep sleep, your blood pressure naturally dips. That is what should happen normally anyway. The cardiovascular system gets a bit of a rest overnight. So if your sleep is fragmented or short or really poor quality, that natural dip doesn't happen. The heart essentially never really fully recovers overnight. Now, studies across large populations have shown that people sleeping under 6 hours have significantly higher rates of heart attack and stroke, and the relationship is consistent across different countries and ethnicities and different age groups as well. And clearly this is a really important association, and from my experience, not many doctors seem to tell their patients this. Now, the reason I find all of this quite hopeful, and I genuinely do find this hopeful despite working in a department where it's full of the consequences of ignoring this stuff, is that the window for changing this trajectory is really big. You know, it's years wide. Aerobic exercise is the most evidence-backed tool that we have for restoring your vessel health. And when you do sustained rhythmic movement like walking briskly or cycling or swimming or rowing, the increased blood flow creates mechanical friction against the blood vessel wall, which is actually a signal that tells the endothelium, that inner lining, to produce more nitric oxide. And studies have shown this happening within weeks of starting exercise, not months or years, but weeks. The biology is more responsive than most people expect. Alongside that, reducing refined carbohydrates, not necessarily cutting them out entirely, but meaningfully reducing them, lowers your circulating insulin. It reduces your sympathetic nervous system activation, and it directly reduces the hormonal load on the vascular system. And the other thing, and this is important, is that the mechanism here isn't primarily about losing weight, because somebody can be relatively lean and still be carrying significant metabolic risk from a high sugar, high refined carb diet. The other important thing is to monitor your own blood pressure at home. This is something I recommend to all of my patients over the age of 50. Well, to be honest, even younger than that. Anybody who's an adult, in my opinion, should be monitoring your blood pressure. And you shouldn't be relying on your doctor for this either, because a validated home monitor used a couple of times a week gives a far more accurate picture than just one reading a year taken at the doctor's. The other thing is to take your sleep really seriously. This is a cardiovascular intervention. Sleep is so important for your health. And addressing obstructive sleep apnea if it's present, and your doctor can do some sleep studies if you've got concerns. So if you wake up in the morning with a really bad head, or if you snore really loudly, or you never feel sort of truly well rested, then sleep apnea could be a diagnosis that's being missed here. So after all of that, let me just say that cardiovascular disease is not inevitable. I know it gets presented that way, something that happens when you get older, or something to be managed and to be expecting as well. That framing, that sort of picture of cardiovascular disease costs lives. The biological cascade that ends in a heart attack or heart failure almost always starts quietly, and it unfolds over years and decades. It passes through a very, very long window where the signals are present, the biology is still reversible, and intervention absolutely works. Now, the patients that I see in resus, these people had years of prior signals. There are always signs and symptoms that present that very often people aren't aware of. And very often they just weren't given a framework to understand what they were noticing. Like the tiredness on the stairs, or that extra pillow, or the slightly puffy ankles, the heart rate that used to sit at 65 and now it's 75. These are not the background noise of getting older. They are the cardiovascular system asking very quietly for attention. And unlike a lot of things in medicine, when you give it attention early on, the outcomes are genuinely good. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So let me start with this. Sugar isn't something that only diabetics need to be thinking about. That is honestly one of the most expensive misconceptions in modern medicine and modern health. The size and the frequency of your glucose spikes after your meals, even if your fasting glucose looks perfect, is quietly shaping how you age, how you feel by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, whether your skin holds up in your 40s, and how likely you are to end up on 3 or 4 medications by the age of 50. And as you know, I've worked in emergency medicine for 10 years, and the more I read into the research on metabolic health and insulin resistance and longevity, the more fascinated I become. This is an enormous subject, and I want to share all of that with you. So if you're new here, then hello, welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Alex, and my mission here is to help you prevent the diseases that I see all the time. And so if you find this video useful, if you get some value from it today, then please, please, please help me out, support what I'm doing here by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Only a small percentage of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. It would mean so much to me if you can do that. Now, what I want to do today in this video is walk you through 10 practical glucose hacks, ranked roughly by how effortless they are to implement them. None of them involve calorie counting, and most of them take less than 30 seconds of thought once you've understood the mechanism. Now, before we get into those 10 hacks, we need to sort of think about what we mean by a glucose spike. So when you eat carbohydrates, they get broken down into glucose in your gut, which is essentially a sugar, and that glucose enters your bloodstream. A spike is just a fast, sharp rise in the amount of sugar circulating in your blood after a meal. The bigger and sharper that rise, the more insulin that your pancreas has to pour out to deal with it. And this really matters because that post-meal peak, what we call postprandial glucose, is a stronger predictor of cardiovascular risk than your fasting glucose number in most people. And there's a really interesting piece of research called the DECODE study, looking at over 22,000 people across Europe. And it found that 2-hour post-meal glucose was more strongly linked to mortality than the fasting value that your doctor usually checks. So basically, every sharp rise drives a corresponding insulin surge, and over years, that pattern is what nudges you towards insulin resistance and fatty liver, and eventually type 2 diabetes, basically metabolic dysfunction that underpins all of the chronic diseases that we see in the Western world that kill us most frequently. So what we want is fewer spikes, smaller spikes, and faster recovery from the ones that we do have. So that's basically what we're trying to achieve here. So here are the 10 hacks for you. Now, hack number 1 is to walk for 5 or 10 minutes after you eat something, 10 minutes preferably. If I could just give you one hack out of this video, it would be this. Your skeletal muscle, the muscle that you can see, these are the biggest glucose disposal organs in the body. When you contract a muscle, it pulls glucose directly out of your bloodstream to use as fuel, because if a muscle is moving, it needs fuel to keep moving, otherwise it will just stop and fatigue. So it uses glucose in your blood to do this. Crucially, and this is the most important part, it can do this without needing any insulin at all. So you're effectively bypassing the whole insulin system and clearing sugar through pure mechanical work. And the reason this is important is that too much sugar and too much insulin in your blood vessels, over time, these are inflammatory. They cause tiny amounts of inflammation in your blood vessel walls, and it's that leads to plaque buildup, which can then rupture and form a blood clot and then cause a heart attack or a stroke. Now, a meta-analysis in sports medicine in 2022 looked at light walking after meals and found big reductions in post-meal glucose compared to sitting after meals, even with walks as short as 2 minutes. Now, 10 minutes is, well, really the bare minimum. If you can only manage 5, then that's better than nothing, obviously, but try and aim for 10 minutes if you can. The calf muscles in your lower leg are particularly effective at this, so even just pacing around your kitchen counts as well. The second hack in this video is to lead your meal with veg. So eating the components of a meal in a specific order changes the glucose curve dramatically. A very small but quite nice Japanese trial in patients with type 2 diabetes showed that consuming veg before carbohydrates reduced the post-meal glucose excursions by roughly 30 to 40% compared with eating carbs first, with the same total meal and calories. But what's actually happening in your gut to cause that? Well, two things are happening. First, the fiber from the vegetables forms a kind of sort of mesh or gel layer in your gut, in your intestine. So when the carbs arrive afterwards, the glucose stops them from seeping into your bloodstream as readily as they would have done before. The second thing is that the protein and the fat that follow the veg and the fiber, they trigger your gut hormones, particularly one called GLP-1, the same hormone that drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro are trying to copy, which further blunts your glucose spike. Really, the simplest form of this hack is to eat your salad or your roasted veg or your soup first before you touch the rice or pasta or bread. And what we do in our home is, as the evening meal is cooking, we chop up a whole celery or a couple of cucumbers or a few carrots, and then we just sort of snack on those as the meal is cooking with some hummus, and we get some really good fiber and protein and fat from the hummus into our gut before the meal has even started, which will mean that anything we eat afterwards will cause less of a glucose spike. And really, that is hack number 3, adding a veggie starter to your lunch or dinner. Really, this is the lazy man's version of hack 2. If you can't reorder a complex meal, just eat a small plate of veg before it, like some hummus and some cucumber or some carrots or a handful of cherry tomatoes or some spoonfuls of slaw if that's what you eat. Try and aim for around a third of the volume of what's coming next. It works through the same fiber preload mechanism, and it's much harder to forget than restructuring an entire plate, because there are some meals where you simply can't eat the veg and the fiber first, let's be honest. So just having a pre-starter full of veg is probably the next best thing. Okay, hack number 4 is to build a savory breakfast around protein. I bang on about this all the time. So the classic British or American breakfast is, metabolically speaking, an absolute disaster. We're talking about cereal or toast with jam or orange juice. God, why do we drink orange juice for breakfast? Or a pastry in the car on the way to work. This is basically concentrated glucose poured into your body that has been fasting for 10 or 14 hours. And this causes probably the biggest glucose spike and insulin spike of the entire day. You will spike really hard, you will crash a couple of hours later, and then you will crave more sugar by mid-morning or late afternoon or whenever. But why is the morning spike worse than a spike later in the day? Well, because cortisol, your stress hormone, is naturally at its peak first thing in the morning. When you wake up, your cortisol already raises your blood sugar to help you wake up. So if you layer a sugar-loaded breakfast on top of that, then you've created literally the worst case scenario for your pancreas before you've even left the house. A savory breakfast built around 25 to 35 grams of protein flips your entire day. So this is things like eggs or Greek yogurt with nuts and seeds, or smoked salmon, or even leftover meat or dinner from the night before, or things like tofu as well. Research from the University of Missouri has shown that high-protein breakfasts reduce the mid-morning cravings and stabilize your sugars for hours and hours afterwards. Just remember that anything that tastes sweet for your breakfast is a dessert, and it's the worst thing that you can be eating. Okay, hack number 5 is to dress your carbohydrates. So carbohydrates eaten alone behave very differently from carbohydrates eaten alongside protein and fat and fiber. But what does that actually look like inside your body? Well, imagine sugar arriving into your bloodstream on a one-lane road, like a country lane. Just on its own, it floods in. If you add protein and fat and fiber to the same meal, then you've effectively put traffic lights and roundabouts on that road. So everything will slow down a bit. Gastric emptying will slow down. The carbs leave your stomach more gradually, and the glucose enters your bloodstream in a much gentler curve. So we're talking something like this rather than a big spike. So if you're going to eat pasta, then eat it with chicken and vegetables and really good extra virgin olive oil rather than just tomato sauce on its own. If you want chocolate, then have it with a handful of almonds, unless it's 75 or 70% or above. If you're having toast, then add eggs and avocado rather than jam. So this isn't about removing the carbohydrates, you're just surrounding it with some friends that slow its absorption. Okay, moving on to hack number 6. This is all about saving anything sweet for your dessert, and the timing really matters here. So the same biscuit eaten at 11 a.m. on an empty stomach produces a very different glucose response from the same biscuit eaten immediately after your lunch. As we've already talked about, an empty stomach allows sugar to hit the small intestine really fast with nothing to buffer it. But a full stomach slows down the whole process because the food already sitting there acts as a physical barrier and a digestive distraction. So if you want something sweet, then just have it as the final part of a meal rather than as a mid-morning or mid-afternoon snack. So you should get the same enjoyment, but you blunt the spike. You avoid triggering the same craving cascade that follows a crash. And what is that craving cascade? Well, it's when you spike really high and then you also crash really low about an hour later. And the brain interprets that as an emergency that needs more sugar. You feel jittery, you feel a bit sort of empty, and so you've got to eat something really sweet or high in carbs. That's why one biscuit at 11 a.m. turns into 3 biscuits by lunchtime. The next one is probably pretty obvious by now. When you snack on something, make it savory rather than sweet. Even if you think it's a healthy snack like a cereal bar, if it tastes sweet, then get rid of it. Snacking on sweet things between your meals is one of the most spike-inducing patterns in modern eating, partly because of the empty stomach effect and partly because it sort of pushes you into a cycle of glucose roller coasters across the entire day. So savory snacks built around protein and fat, like a simple boiled egg or a piece of cheese or some Greek yogurt or some olives or a handful of salted nuts, keeps you in a flatter glucose curve during the day and actually makes you feel fuller for longer than anything that's ultra-processed. The 8th hack in this video is about sleeping like your glucose depends on it, becoming an expert sleeper. And this one clearly is very different to the dietary hacks earlier in the video. Now, a landmark study published in The Lancet, one of the biggest journals that we have, restricted healthy young men to 4 hours of sleep a night for 6 nights in a row. And their glucose tolerance dropped to the sort of levels that we see in pre-diabetic older adults, just 6 nights in healthy 20-somethings. But what does insulin sensitivity actually mean here? Because this is what we're talking about. Well, it's how well your cells respond when insulin tells them to take in glucose from your bloodstream. When you are insulin sensitive, which is a good thing, your cells listen and they clear the sugar away pretty quickly. But when you're insulin resistant, which is a bad thing, which is what poor sleep drives you towards, your cells stop listening and sugar lingers around in your bloodstream and your pancreas simply has to shout louder and produce more and more insulin. And that state, sustained over years and decades, which is what we're talking about with these sorts of videos. It's about sort of building habits over the long run. That state really is the runway to type 2 diabetes. So if you're eating perfectly, but you're sleeping for 5 hours, you are fighting almost a losing battle. So you need to aim for 7 to 9 hours and protect your sleep environment, and stop treating sleep like the variable that you can compromise on. Because when you're sleeping, that is when your body does the majority of its repair work. And if you're sleeping 5 hours a night, then there's a very good chance you're going to have some serious health problems later on. Our penultimate hack, hack number 9, is to lift something heavy at least twice a week. And again, it sits outside these typical glucose hack lists because most people don't think of it as a glucose intervention, but it absolutely is.